Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Counterpoint Podcast. My name is Maurice, and I'll be your host this week. And we've actually got a very interesting topic lined up for you today, which is a report that we just published on fixed wireless access, or FWA for short. It's a really emerging and growing market that we'd love to share with y'all. Before we get to that, I want to introduce you to today's guests. Which are Tina Liu, the senior analyst at Counterpoint Research. She's in charge of the Latin American market for us, and Shiv Pucha, who is a founder and principal analyst of Mandala Insights, who is also a telecoms and mobility analyst. Hey, everyone. How's it going?
Hi, Maurice. How are you today?
Hi, Maurice. Very good. Thanks.
Great. Glad. Welcome to the show. So let's get started. So FWA is getting a lot of traction recently, and really primarily because it's this new use case for 5G NR, or 5G new radio architecture. Can you tell me a little bit more of the reason for this?
Sure. So at the very outset, I think it is important to note that fixed wireless access, or FWA, is not a new technology per se. The current interest in FWA as one of the earliest use cases for 5G, I think you can characterize this as kind of the third wave of FWA. Previous versions have appeared with, WiMAX, if you remember that, other proprietary technologies, and then again, it's come back through LTE as well. But however, all these previous waves have had limited traction or success, for multiple reasons. Architecture, the ecosystem was less mature, or there just weren't enough devices, and a host of factors. But right now, I think the service providers, mobile operators, telecom service providers, are looking at FWA as a means to monetize their early investments in 5G networks. The technology is getting a lot of interest, especially from mobile operators who want to push into the fixed broadband segment, both for residential, as well as the small and medium enterprise or small office, home office type of segments as well.
Right. And that's actually really interesting too. And thank you for mentioning that history on fixed wireless access. And of course, from my perspective in the US, Verizon is very much looking into fixed wireless access to push their 5G use case. And now, naturally, there are also other alternatives, right, to for people to have connectivity, such as fiber, cable, DSL, which is especially something that hasn't reached a lot of these last mile connectivities. Do you think that fixed wireless 5G is the way forward to reach these last mile connections that are, say, in more rural areas, or somewhere more hard to reach areas where you can't have that physical cable or fiber available?
Yes, I think FWA is ideally suited to bridging this challenge of last mile connectivity. So, the last mile has involved significant and often very complicated investments in the final local loop, to the consumer's household or an enterprise premise. For service providers, fixed broadband deployments are usually complicated by variations in the location, in the topology, the demographics of the community or neighborhood. Ideally, everybody wants fiber. Cable and DSL are kind of limited in speed and they don't scale easily. But this means that, the service provider needs to do a fiber pass to get as close as possible to the target household or premise, right? But this is very challenging because this involves, getting permits from local municipal and or other agencies, and you have to employ construction crews and installation engineers, all of which can be costly and time consuming. Basically, it becomes less of a network rollout as much as a civil construction type of project. The result has been that in several markets and situations, the fixed fiber or copper penetration is still low because of these kind of issues, the exorbitant costs that are associated with laying fiber, and the amount of time that you need to get the so-called rights of way access and construction permits.
Yeah, so I think that's actually, one of these drivers for fixed wireless momentum right now. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the other drivers that you looked at when publishing this report?
So basically, we are looking at at this point, I mean, there is low broadband penetration. So at Counterpoint, we estimate that 45% of the household worldwide has currently, at the end of 2019, broadband penetration. But if we take out China out of that whole equation, then we only have 28% of the global household connected to broadband. So this is the primary drive, to the growth of FWAs. And then also COVID, that it's making broadband a priority. It's not just a luxury that I would like to, it's a need. I need it to study, I need to work. Everything goes through, the broadband. So that's COVID has changed the need of access of broadband. And the other is also what talk about earlier. She talked about the 5G spectrum, and there is more spectrum. The government is realizing that there's more spectrum available for this 5G and be able to drive the growth of FWA. And last but not least is also the CPE is becoming, so it's the modem that enables the technology, is becoming more affordable. And the drive of that, the pricing going down, that's also helping and driving the growth of FWA.
Interesting. Shiv, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I think one small point to sort of supplement what Tina has said. She's covered quite a lot of ground in terms of the drivers, but the one other thing is that governments around the world have been taking a very active, or much more active role in driving broadband plans. Basically they want universal broadband. This has come front and center these days, and a lot of this is targeted towards the so-called next billion segment. You mentioned earlier on about the situation in the United States, where the FCC is heavily pushing broadband options to connect rural households and others who are. I mean, it's not because of a lack of, at least in the US, it's not because of a lack of the ability to pay, but it's just access. Whereas you come to countries like India or Indonesia and others, you have both problems, right? So they have been creating subsidies, doing a lot of things, policies to encourage service providers to, basically put more broadband out there. And now, most of that has been focused on building the fiber kind of backbones and everything else. But now they have a new tool to add, I guess, to the arsenal with FWA. And I think that's certainly a factor, another driver to add here, which is government involvement, directly and indirectly.
Yeah, and I think those points that you mentioned about we have only 28% of households with FWA connectivity. If you take out China, for example, increased 5G spectrum, lowering costs and government involvement, all are really driving factors. And I know that and Shiv, you particularly talked already about a couple of challenges that FWA is also facing, such as, the problems about like regulation and also network. But can you just dive in a little bit deeper for us and talk a little bit more about what the challenges are for FWA deployment?
Sure, I can do that. Actually, this is one I could talk about for quite some time. So let me just try to kind of pass this and kind of run through it one by one, at least the major challenges that come to mind right now. So let me just caveat this and say that I'm going to talk more about kind of deployment issues, or specific issues around the implementation, right? So one of the biggest challenges has to do with distance or range, basically from the base station to the CPE, or the customer premise equipment, which from a consumer or a customer point of view would basically look like a router or a box. In some cases it's indoor, in some cases it would be fixed outdoor, connected to some other router inside. So there are some variations there, but the issue starts to come because FWA on 5G will be deployed in higher bands, frequency bands than LTE is today. LTE typically will run up to 2.1, maybe 2.3 or 2.5 at the most. So we're talking about 3.5, which is mid-band and higher, as you get to millimeter wave. Now, the issue is that when you're utilizing millimeter wave bands, as in the case of Verizon, that the base station needs to ideally be within, say, 500 meters of the CPE. Now, if the CPE is located indoors, then the distance requirement shrinks even more to under 300 meters. So that means that the base station has to be really close to the household. And how many can you have, right? So if you, on the flip side, if you're using a lower band, say 3.5 and not 28 gigahertz, so 3.5, which is what, say, Optus is using in Australia, then you don't have the coverage issues so much, but there is a hard trade-off with how much capacity you have. Basically, the capacity is lower than with millimeter wave. So there's a pretty hard trade-off there. So this is the first kind of big challenge that comes to mind. Another one, especially true with millimeter wave, is the issue of signal path loss due to obstacles like foliage and buildings. Right? Basically, millimeter wave doesn't play so nice if there's a tree or something blocking it, right? Blocking the signal. There's also an issue of interference, which results in signals tending to fade, particularly as you go indoors. And I mentioned foliage, but there could be other natural barriers too. So this is kind of a constant issue that service providers have to deal with. A third one relates to the issue of backhaul or transport networks for handling the traffic that comes from FWA devices. In other words, how do service providers connect their base stations? The traffic comes from the CPE to the base station, and then how does it go back to the core network? Ideally, this would be over fiber. However, this metric varies widely across markets. Now, you live in the United States. Fiber is not so much an issue, but I live in India. So it's not 80% of sites fiberized. It's barely 20%. So this has huge implications for what kind of or for the scope of the service that a service provider is considering, right? And lastly, one more thing that comes to mind is even though, let's say, FWA promises a lot of capex savings, but it does not save on OpEx costs. What do I mean by this? Basically, if you're going to put an installation, the service provider would still need to do what is known as a truck roll to complete the install. That is, they'll have to send a technician to your house or to your office who comes and he'll poke around and he'll look for the ideal placement and then pull out the toolbox and set it up. But that's costly because if it's just one person, not a big deal. But you extrapolate that over an entire neighborhood, an entire city, or an entire country. That's a lot of OpEx costs. So to get around this, many vendors, Nokia, Huawei, Samsung, several others, they've all announced the so-called self-install gateway routers. So these are pretty sleek designs, but they also have mobile apps that help customers identify the correct placement for the CPE. So these are some of the things that you need to consider when a service provider is out there trying to plan an FWA rollout. These are some of the on-ground challenges that come to mind.
Right, and actually on that last part on the OpEx cost, right, with the technician coming in and having to install, I remember being at a showcase for Verizon where they actually showed that self-install piece and how to do that. And naturally, some of the challenges there is also, again, finding the right place of where to put it. You still have potentially a ribbon cable or something like that will be exposed, and how to deal with that with different types of weather and temperatures around. So all these things need to be considered really when you're trying to look into how to make this as seamless and easy to install as possible. which actually brings me to another question, particularly now for COVID, right? Since the lockdown happened, and we are actually seeing a lot of pent-up demand right now for the smartphone market, and which has led to a recovery of the market in terms of sales. And now with also more people working and also doing school distance learning from home, it's really become the new normal to stay at home, to have good connectivity. What are you seeing right now in the market in terms of pent up demand for FWA or other connectivity? Can you explain that a little bit more for us?
Basically, what COVID showed us is broadband is not a luxury, as I said before, anymore. It's a need. And broadband for all is a priority for the people to have it. And also, later on we talk about the government. So in recent month, with all this COVID, that we all of a sudden we are all locked down at our homes, we realized that we need a very fast and stable broadband access. And that's beyond the smartphone. We used to be okay with only the smartphone that you use at home or a tablet, but now you have the need had changed. So now what brought is you not only have the new users that that to cover the other 72% of the rest of the world that don't have broadband access, but you also have the user that needs to upgrade to a faster access. So no, and so this too, and for those existing users that need to update to a faster network, they need a stable download and upload connection, and FWA definitely brings that, as opposed of older generations technology to access to broadband. And so that brought into the need to more deployment, and the deployment, as Chief told before, for fiber, and it's very expensive. So FWA become the best solution for fast deployment. And then that brought me into the need of the broadband and how much COVID had changed our need. It's brought me a story that I heard last week on a webinar, that 40% of the US students do not have adequate connection and for study at home. So all of a sudden, because you have several computer and you need access to online class on whatever online tool you're using, and there's two, because the parents also are having online, so that's that they don't have that adequate connection. Now if you think that US, like, only 40%, so 60% do not have connection, what is left for us that live in developing countries? The gap, it's also bigger and that wider. And so the need of broadband has definitely it's up into our face with the COVID-19. And the government also realizing this, they're realizing that if they want the economy to continue, they do need to provide a fast and stable broadband. So they are also in their best interest to provide frequency and regulations to allow the deployment of FWA, 5G FWA, or 4G.
Right, and on that example, Tina, I believe some schools in the U.S. are even trying to employ FWA private networks in order to get connectivity to those in need, right, with this distant learning in place. But Shiv, do you have anything else to add on this?
Yeah, Tina's talking about online school just got me thinking of sort of my day-to-day reality here now, because I have two daughters, they're 10 years old, and they have basically taken over every gadget in the house, because I every Wi-Fi network, everything that is on, the laptops, I have devices missing when I'm supposed to work. It's quite it's quite interesting what's happened in the time of COVID, and I know that I would certainly welcome a high speed FWA service that can keep them happy and keep them from jumping from gadget to gadget. Um, but those sort of more anecdotal things aside, I mean, I have sort of one other um, kind of takeaway, which is more from a service provider angle. But for me, one of the biggest learnings from the lockdown is that if you're a service provider, all assumptions you had about traffic patterns and network planning kind of go out the window. So basically, the major difference, we're all locked down, we happen, so you're not mobile any longer. And traffic, while traffic has jumped, it now tends to skew towards hotspots, and it becomes more consistent through the day. In other words, the traffic is now more localized, and there are potentially several mobile cell sites that have seen dramatic increases in capacity and several that have seen decreases. Moreover, there is no peak hour traffic anymore. People are on pretty much all the time, right? So where possible, service providers have increased capacity to handle these kind of surges. But without fresh allocations of spectrum, this is going to get really challenging, especially in crowded urban areas. And the telcos are already under strain, and many of them are really kind of just about holding things together. So enabling them to launch an FWA service with new spectrum, like Tina said, there should be governments should be thinking about this actively now. That would be a very welcome step, because I certainly believe there are a lot of use cases now, a lot more use cases now, a lot more demand now for services like FWA.
Right, for sure. From the U.S. perspective, again, we've seen and carriers also have been telling us drastic drop in handoffs for phone calls. Their networks are constantly loaded. So it definitely showcases a need, as you said, for more different ways of connectivity and more spectrum to be available for this. But now, Tina, since we published this report, what are our estimates for FWA subscribers for the next decade? And if you can talk a little bit more about subscriber share by region, any insights that you can give us on that?
Sure, glad to do that. Before we talk to the next decade, let me tell you how is it right now. I see at least how at Counterpoint we see for the end of 2020. So we see 60 million users for both 4G and 5G users by the end of 2020. And 17.9% are 5G. So the 5G participation there is still very low. We'll see very low comparison. See only 10 million 5G FWA users by end of 2020. And US will be leading this pie by 39%. So US is driving the growth of FWA. They deployment of millimeter wave in metro areas and the CBRS in the rural area. So is driving FWA growth in the US. But looking forward, so we see that by 2025 there will be 200 million users. So we go for 60 to 200, 160 million users increase in FWA, but it's even more dramatic, the increase in 5G FWA users. Will we have 160 million 5G FWA users by the end of 2025? And this number will grow to 460 million 5G FWA users by the end of 2030. So the growth is dramatic in the next few years and in the next 10 years. And we'll see by the end of 2030, Europe will be leading with 31% of this whole pie. And why Europe? Because Europe already have a massive amount of DSL right now, and that will migrate into FWA. They have problems. The fiber is not quite there, and because they have problem of deployment of fiber network, going roads, and so that leads and give opportunity to the growth of 5G FWA.
Interesting. Especially, yeah, how Europe is going to grow in 2030. Well, before we conclude, I know we talked about a lot of different areas right now, from what are the growth drivers, what are the challenges, to the COVID impacts even. Is there anything else both of you would like to share on the future outlook for FWA that you haven't mentioned yet?
Okay. Yeah, let me just say that this is an exciting time for 5G FWA. We see almost 46% of compounded annual growth from 2020 to 2030. That's a huge amount of growth. And on the other hand, we are talking about the government. I mean, so the government is also acknowledging this at this time about the COVID. Just one thing that many government are allowing network slicing to deploy FWA, and this is a run that's already started, a race that already started the carrier, and with the blessing of some of many governments.
I have been tracking FWA for some time, and I'm quite excited with. It marked sort of late 2020 as the year things would take off. Obviously, COVID has kind of mixed that picture up a little bit, but it's a very exciting time for FWA as a technology, especially the 5G variant of this. That said, I just want to, going forward, I think it's important to point out that the real momentum will really kind of start picking up from, I believe, Q4 of 2020, and a lot of this has just to do with the price of the CPE. So if you look at the range, so the cheapest 5G CPE today comes around 500, rising to nearly 1,000 for a full featured sort of model. It needs to drop much lower, right, for to boost adoption, and I think this is going to happen. So we're expecting to see a raft of new kind of devices come into the market in Q3, going into Q4, and I think that'll really make a difference. But the other things to look out for, I think, is also maybe where you mentioned schools doing FWA as a private network. I think that's actually going to be a significant area of activity, and I mean in the enterprise. So not just small and medium business or sort of SOHO segments, but branch locations, various things that are not easy to, as companies think about the wide area network and extending that. Sometimes the best way to do that is through FWA in certain situations. So that's definitely a very interesting area to look at. But it also, when you talk about the enterprise, there's a lot of other things that come into it. How is FWA going to work with Wi-Fi 6? How is it going to work with small cells in different deployment scenarios? Will it replace it? Will it supplement it? I mean, these are all very sort of interesting trends that I think will play out in the next year or two. But definitely a big role for FWA. So yeah, exciting times.
Yeah, certainly. And, I think, one of the big things for 2020, at least in the beginning of 2020 and at the end of 2019, was to find that, killer 5G use case. And a lot of carriers are really looking into where can 5G really play a greater role, and where can we find that use case that really, hits it out of the park. And FWA certainly right now looks very promising for that aspect. Well, I think that wraps up our show for today. Thank you both for joining me on this. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you, Maurice. Thanks for having me on.
If you would like to know more about the report or what we're doing for research, please go on our website, counterpointresearch.com. We'll also have a link down below to access the report. Until next time, have a good one.